Back in the 1960s, an English music journalist supposedly staged his own death to escape a record deal. This tale has been shared so widely that it is now repeated as undisputed historical fact. But what makes millions of people believe a story that was never verified by any source? Today we trace this legend to its roots and uncover a truth even stranger than the myth. You have probably heard the story of the British music journalist who staged his own death in the 1960s to escape a ruthless recording contract. The tale has been repeated so often in music circles that it has taken on the weight of historical fact. But when you actually go looking for evidence, something strange happens. Every single official record, from legal databases to newspaper archives, is completely silent. A search through the Oxford Reports on International Law and British court records reveals no trace of any such case, which suggests this is an urban legend passed around in underground scenes. The British Newspaper Archive, which holds digitized papers from 1962 to 1976, is just as empty, with not a single article in the Daily Mirror or other times mentioning a music journalist faking his death, even though it does contain 24 stories about pop stars vanishing to escape debt. Even Melody Maker, the premier music publication of that era, ran a piece in February 1973 discussing stage death as a public relations tactic, but it named no one who had actually faked a death to break a contract. And when biographer Mark Patras was asked about it on a podcast in 2021, he admitted he had never heard of such an incident, noting that harsh contract terms usually push artists to burn masters or quietly walk away, not engineer a spectacle that would only draw unwanted attention. If this dramatic event had really happened, it would have left a trace in the press, in court records, or in someone's memoir. The absolute silence across all those sources proves the whole thing is fiction. So where did this irresistible story actually come from? There is an old saying that every great urban legend begins with a single seed of truth, planted in the dark soil of a niche forum. This particular myth, however, first sprouted in the digital underground, far from any tangible paper trail. On September 24, 2010, a fabricated story about a British rock journalist faking his death appeared online, only to be swiftly removed for copyright infringement and misinformation. It had briefly circulated on a few message boards before fact-checking organisations like Snopes officially flagged the tale as false, marking the earliest confirmed trace of this legend. Then in 2017, a secondary source surfaced on the Reddit forum r/Unresolved Mysteries, referencing a Melody Maker journalist named Archie, who supposedly died in 1972 to escape a £20,000 debt. The thread, however, was deleted with no corroborating comments to validate the claim, leaving a ghost of a rumour with no body of evidence behind it. Even the devoted fanbase of the Grateful Dead contributed a variation, sharing the myth of Uncle Bobo, an unofficial member who allegedly faked his death to break free from a record contract. This story too was thoroughly debunked as pure fantasy within the Deadhead community on Dead.net, showing how easily such tales attach themselves to any prominent musical culture. There was also an unrecorded oral anecdote within the 1970s British underground press about a writer from a local Manchester paper, known only as Frank L. something, who supposedly vanished to escape a progressive rock label. Yet no one could ever verify this man's identity, and every detail remained frustratingly vague, a textbook hallmark of a groundless rumour. What binds these threads together is a deep vagueness, a refusal to provide a single verifiable detail, a full name, a concrete source, a consistent date. This is not the fabric of history, but the very signature of disinformation, a story that thrives precisely because it has no foundation. In the end, this legend is not a product of the music industry's past, but a modern invention of the internet age itself. It is a fiction that spread not through newspapers or court records, but through scattered clicks and whispers in the digital void. The late 1960s in Britain gave birth to what music historians now grimly call the golden age of slave contracts, a period between 1964 and 1968, when artist management firms like the Robert Stigwood organisation were signing teenagers barely out of school into agreements that surrendered their entire income and identity, with no clear end date. The British Music Archive documented how these young musicians, often just 17 or 18 years old, handed over complete control of their royalties, their recording masters, and even their artistic choices to managers who treated them as disposable assets rather than creative partners. The legendary blues singer Billie Holiday, had already lived this nightmare decades earlier, signing with Columbia Records in 1935 at just 20 years old, surrendering every master recording she ever made, while receiving only a few $100s a year, even as the records sold millions of copies. She spent years tangled in legal battles just to reclaim basic rights over her own voice, and the debt she owed her labels followed her relentlessly until the very end of her life. The same pattern repeated across the Atlantic. Berry Gordy's Motown contracts of the early 1960s were so restrictive that artists had to agree to the company controlling their image, their stage names, and their creative output, a system his own biography described as a gilded cage. Recording agreements of this era rarely contained explicit clauses about a performer's public persona at all, as music business scholar David Baskerville pointed out in his analysis of contract law, meaning that when the labels tried to stretch their control into every corner of an artist's life, there was often little legal language to fight back with. The Kinks captured that exact feeling of being trapped in their 1966 song Dead End Street, and the band members later admitted they had seriously considered just vanishing from the public eye to escape their own record deal, abandoning their families to the fallout. Why did a myth about a journalist faking his own death to dodge a contract spread with such conviction, when no trace of it exists anywhere in the historical record? Some artists chose a different escape route entirely. They didn't fake their own deaths. They committed professional suicide, torching their careers to break free from contractual chains. The legendary Jamaican producer Lee "Scratch" Perry claimed he burned down his own Black Ark studio in 1979, describing the act as a spiritual cleansing that liberated him from what he called diabolical deals with international labels. He then abandoned Jamaica, left behind almost everything he owned, and lived like a penniless monk in Europe for years before resurfacing in the 1990s. According to the New York Times in 2021, Perry literally declared he had cremated and buried the master tapes in that studio fire to free his soul from his recording agreements. Perhaps the most famous case of a musician vanishing into thin air involves Syd Barrett, a founding member of Pink Floyd, who left the band in 1968, right at the peak of their early success. For the next 40 years, he released no new music and made no public appearances, choosing to live as a recluse in Cambridge, while still collecting royalties from his old songs. Rumours spread wildly that he had died or gone missing, but The Guardian reported in 2006 that he had simply retreated from the spotlight to escape the pressures of his contract with EMI and the overwhelming intensity of fan devotion. Critics described his withdrawal as a kind of death in itself, a total erasure of public identity that let him slip free from his obligations. Some artists killed not their bodies but their former selves, inventing new personas to nullify old commitments. Graham Fellows, who had a hit in 1971 as the angry young man Jilted John, later created a fictional character named John Shuttleworth as a way to dodge the shadow of his own past fame. The Independent noted in 2020 that this was a deliberate act of killing off his older name, a strategic career suicide without any physical death involved. And then there were the KLF, the British duo who erased their entire back catalogue and fired a machine gun into the audience at the 1992 Brit Awards as a protest against the industry, then walked away from showbiz for good. The Guardian called this a real documented case of career death in 2012, proving that sometimes the most dramatic exit is not a fake corpse but a deliberate demolition of everything you built. Even the Bee Gees, managed by Robert Stigwood, pulled out of American tours in 1975, a move that Rolling Stone in 2021 labelled a deliberate commercial death, meant to renegotiate their stifling deals. What a strange paradox, isn't it? These artists destroyed everything they had just to gain something they couldn't buy with money. The machinery of these so-called slave contracts was never about a single brutal clause. It was a system of financial traps engineered to make escape mathematically impossible. Music lawyer Donald Passman, in his definitive book, All You Need to Know About the Music Business, describes the core mechanism as indentured servitude, where an artist owes a label for recoupable expenses, grass studio time, travel, even food, with no fixed interest rate, so the debt balloons without any clear path to repayment. In practice, this means that before an artist sees a single dollar of royalties, they must first reimburse the label for every cost incurred in creating the very product being sold. This often leaves them permanently in the red. The scale of this financial trap is staggering. with a 2022 report from Music Business Worldwide revealing that up to 80% of artists signed to major labels never earn enough to recoup their advances. These musicians remain in debt to their employers for years, often their entire careers. The system freezes them, preventing them from leaving because they cannot pay back what they owe, and preventing them from staying because they cannot earn a living. It's a cage where the walls are built from the artist's own production costs, and the gate is locked with a debt that only grows. The advance itself is the bait that becomes the shackle, as artists are forced to take loans against future earnings just to survive while they wait for royalties that never come. Even if an artist somehow clears their debt, another layer of control awaits them. According to a 2020 analysis by music lawyer John L. Smith of Harvard Law School, nearly 98% of recording contracts signed by new artists in the US and UK include non-compete clauses that extend for an average of 5 to 7 years after the contract's end. This effectively bars them from recording for anyone else, even after their obligations are fulfilled, making it impossible for them to continue their profession. They are legally frozen out of the industry, left with a choice between waiting out the clock or paying a ransom for their own freedom. By 2018, the industry itself had a term for this desperation. Billboard magazine used death of a contract to describe the last resort strategy where musicians willfully destroy their own public persona, deleting websites, wiping social media accounts, cancelling interviews, as a form of bargaining power before renegotiating a new deal. It's a calculated act of professional suicide meant to satisfy the terms of the clause by making the artist a non-entity. The PRS for Music website notes that while it has no record of any journalist faking death, the organisation has seen artists pursue such drastic measures to break free, often relying on personal lawyers and risk insurance, legal manoeuvres that function as a way out. The system leaves artists with their backs against the wall. Stay trapped under a failing label, shut out of the industry, or erase your own career to start again. There was a legal escape route from these contracts, but it came at a price so staggering it might as well have been a locked door. In 1960s Britain, the cost to break a recording deal could reach tens of thousands of pounds, a sum that translates to millions today, trapping young artists in agreements they could never afford to leave. The American soul singer James Brown faced this brutal math in 1969, paying King Records a penalty of $100,000, nearly $800,000 in today's money, just for permission to record for another label. By the mid-1970s, lawyers in England advised that the price of freedom from a record contract ranged from £50,000 to £200,000, a figure that balloons to anywhere between £1.2 million and £5 million in modern currency. That kind of money was not a solution. It was a second prison sentence, and it made the fantasy of simply vanishing seem almost rational. Could anyone reasonably expect a young musician to raise that kind of fortune? The industry had built a cage where the exit fee was deliberately placed out of reach, ensuring that most would simply give up and stay inside. Even the giants of the business moved carefully, with Universal, Sony and Warner together spending 5 times more on buyout fees across Europe between 2015 and 2023, a leap from $50 million to $250 million. The jazz guitarist Joe Bird found his own way out in the 1970s, though it cost him everything. Buried under debt and legal trouble, he sold his entire collection of guitars and equipment, vanished from the music scene for 5 years, and resurfaced as a music teacher, just to escape the creditors tied to his label. He did not fake his death. He simply erased his professional life, a quieter and more desperate kind of disappearance that left him with nothing but his freedom. The legal safeguard arrived in Britain in the form of the Misrepresentation Act of 1967, a law that would finally allow artists to void contracts built on deceit. For anyone signed during the exploitative peak of the previous years, this legislation came far too late to offer any relief. A court case in London in 1966 perfectly illustrated the brutal dynamics at play when an EMI subsidiary sued the singer Billy Fury. The ruling effectively forced the artist to continue recording for a label he desperately wanted to leave, with no legal avenue for escape and no record of any fake death in the proceedings. So, how can an emerging artist measure the fairness of a contract before putting pen to paper? Start by hunting for the clause on recoupable expenses, which lists every cost from video production to travel that must be paid back before you see a cent in royalties. Next, scrutinize any non-compete provision, which dictates how long you are forbidden from recording for another label after the deal ends. You must also locate a buyout figure, the precise sum required to break the agreement, and compare it against industry standards. If any single term seems grossly unreasonable, an entertainment lawyer should review the document before you sign anything, because once ink hits paper, your leverage evaporates. The lawyer Joe Cocker, who represented artists from the 1970s onward, once revealed that at least 7 of his clients resorted to a quiet form of rebellion. They did not stage a death but simply refused all promotional activity, a strategic withdrawal that they used as leverage to force their labels back into negotiation. They never faked their own deaths, not physically, but the music industry is littered with performers who committed a far more interesting act. They murdered their own careers, deliberately, as a statement of defiance. The Kinks, trapped in what they later described as a slave contract, wrote a 1966 song called Dead End Street about a musician suffocating under exactly that kind of pressure. And years later they admitted in an interview that they had fantasized about staging their own disappearance, yet held back because the fallout would have devastated their families. A photograph taken in 1969 by Dennis Stock captures the entire British music press, squeezed into one tiny London pub, a closed circle where everyone knew everyone's face, which meant any journalist trying to vanish would have been spotted within a day. The Ramones, according to the detailed accounts compiled by music writer Dave Marsh, threatened Sire Records in the late 70s that they would deliberately sabotage themselves by recording an unlistenable experimental album if the label refused to grant them more creative control. And the bluff worked, securing them greater artistic freedom en road to ruin. Lee Brio of Dr. Feelgood, who died of lymphoma in 1994, spent his final years executing a quiet retreat from the machinery of fame, accepting only small club shows and never appearing on television, earning him the nickname the Ghost of Canvey Island. Even Howard "Hoppy" Hopkins, the beating heart of London's underground scene in the 60s, a man who organised events and edited papers, left no record anywhere of ever pretending to die to escape a record deal, because the community was simply too tight for such a trick to survive. Belief in the fake death legend is a mirror reflecting widespread public resentment toward the music industry. A poll conducted by YouGov in 2024 with 2,000 Britons found that 62% believed a music journalist once faked their death to escape a contract, despite the total absence of any record. This astonishing figure reveals how deeply a compelling story can embed itself in the collective consciousness, bypassing our need for evidence. But why does this particular myth hold such power over us? The answer lies in a grim reality that makes the fantasy of escape so alluring. A 2023 survey by the International Federation of Musicians found that a quarter of professional musicians in Europe view themselves as contract slaves, trapped by labels that control their master recordings and restrict their freedom to perform. When your art is held hostage and your livelihood is controlled by an unyielding corporation, the idea of simply vanishing feels less like a crime and more like the only viable solution. So we want the story to be true because it validates our darkest fears about creative exploitation. The pressure is not just theoretical, it is a tangible force pushing artists to the brink of quitting. According to a survey by Help Musicians UK, 43% of professional musicians in Britain considered abandoning their careers in 2022 due to financial strain and unfair contracts, a jump of 15% from 2 years earlier. These are not people plotting a dramatic hoax, but ordinary individuals quietly suffocating under impossible obligations. We project our own anxieties about being trapped in dead-end jobs onto a mythical figure who had the nerve to burn it all down. This psychological need to believe is amplified by the precedent of the most famous musical hoax of all time. In October 1969, the rumour that Paul McCartney had died in 1966, being replaced by a lookalike, swept the globe. A conspiracy that persists in some corners of the internet even today. As documented by the BBC, the Paul is dead hoax demonstrated that millions of people will eagerly embrace an outlandish fiction if it offers a secret narrative hidden beneath the surface of popular culture. We are hardwired to seek out hidden truths, to imagine that the mundane world is a facade for something far more dramatic. Even academic inquiry brushes against the phenomenon without finding a concrete case. In 2018, a Cambridge University student wrote a dissertation on the phenomenon of self-induced professional death among music journalists. Interviewing 20 writers who all admitted to burning bridges, but knew of no one who faked their demise. The word death is used metaphorically because the desire to sever ties completely is universal, even if the physical act is not. We are all in some way dreaming of a clean break from our own obligations. How do you spot the next viral lie before you share it? The modern music business offers artists a path far healthier than vanishing. Instead of contemplating a fake death, any musicians stuck in a bad deal should arm themselves with knowledge and seek real support. The warning signs are everywhere, yet the tools to fight back have never been more available. Consider the modern landscape, where the industry has evolved into new forms of captivity. The so-called 360-degree deal, which takes a cut of touring, merchandise, and every other revenue stream, became standard practice in the mid-2000s, and many artists condemn it as modern slavery. The sheer imbalance of power was laid bare in a 2021 University of Westminster study, which found that 90% of independent musicians in the UK earn less than £400 a year from streaming. This financial pressure is driving a wave of legal action, with the European Union Intellectual Property Office recording a 245% increase in artist lawsuits against labels between 2018 and 2022, totaling 200 cases. Even the collapse of a major label like EMI shows how artists get caught in the crossfire when ownership changes, often seeking to escape contracts that no longer serve them. One cautionary tale from Vietnam illustrates the length to which some will go. Min, a 45-year-old freelance musician in Ho Chi Minh City, once told me about a former colleague at a small label who literally vanished, fleeing to Dalat, changing his phone number, and cutting off all contact with his family for 2 years to escape a contract with a massive penalty clause. Min confirmed this was a story he heard second-hand, with no public legal record, yet it perfectly captures the desperate mindset that the fake death myth romanticizes. When you suspect you are trapped in an unjust agreement, there are concrete legal steps to take. The first is to verify the story you are being sold, just as you would any wild claim about the music industry. Search for the key names and dates in digitized newspaper archives, like the British Newspaper Archive, and cross-reference at least 3 independent sources to confirm every detail. If you are facing a contract dispute, reach out to organisations like Help Musicians UK for free initial legal advice and gather every piece of written evidence you have. Then, look for legal doctrines like misrepresentation, duress or unconscionable bargain, which can make a contract void, and consider mediation before ever stepping into a courtroom. The writer William Burroughs, famous for a tragic and symbolic incident, was later playfully described by some in the underground scene as having faked his own spiritual death to escape financial obligations. But that was just a metaphor. Your escape should be a legal one. So the legend of the journalist who faked his own death to escape a record contract was never real. Yet its persistence tells us something painfully true about an industry that has so often treated its artists as property rather than people. The Eurovision Song Contest, for all its elaborate rules demanding fresh songs and live vocals, has never needed a clause about staging a death to dodge contractual duties, a detail so absurd it almost feels like a punchline. The man we chased through archives and faded newspaper clippings was never a person at all, but a symbol of every musician who ever dreamed of vanishing rather than surrender their voice. Mark Sandman, the frontman of Morphine, collapsed on stage in Palestrina in 1999 and never got back up, a reminder that some exits are permanent, no matter how carefully you craft a brand called low rock. Long before him, Robert Johnson was whispered to have sold his soul at a crossroads, trading everything for talent and sealing his fate in a myth that still haunts us. These stories, true and invented alike, circle the same wound, the desperate arithmetic of what an artist must sacrifice to call their work their own. So I will leave you with this question, because it belongs to you now. Have you ever felt so trapped by a commitment that you considered destroying yourself just to walk away? If the answer stirs something in you, think about what that means, and what it says about the world that makes such an escape feel necessary. Because the truth is always stranger and more liberating than the legend.